Which African countries are growing the fastest? Before I answer that, let me challenge the frame. Because when most people think about Africa and economics, the first word that comes to mind is poverty. The second word is aid. Maybe the third is potential. Rarely is the first thought. These are some of the fastest growing economies in the world. But that is the reality. For most of the first 2 decades of the 21st century, multiple African economies consistently ranked among the world's fastest growing. Not fast for Africa. Fast, period. Faster than China. Faster than India in some years. Faster than any country in Europe or North America. The story of Africa's economic renaissance is one of the most underreported stories of our time. And today, we're going to tell it, with evidence, with specificity, and with the full context of what fast growth means, what it creates, and what it still hasn't fixed. Welcome to GriotWave Academy. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind GriotWave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. GriotWave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Let's establish the scale. Africa's combined GDP is approximately $3.4 trillion. That makes it the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world if treated as a single entity, ahead of India, ahead of France, ahead of the UK, ahead of Brazil. The GDP figure almost nobody knows. Between 2000 and 2023, Africa's average annual GDP growth rate was approximately 3.6%. The global average over the same period was about 1.9%. Africa outgrew the world. 6 or more African countries have consistently posted GDP growth rates above 7% per year for a decade or more. 7% per year means an economy doubles in size in roughly 10 years. These are transformational growth rates. The IMF projects Africa's GDP will reach $4.2 trillion by 2030 in the baseline scenario, with more optimistic projections exceeding $5 trillion if the Africa Continental Free Trade Area gains traction. And 1.4 billion people, soon to be 2 billion by 2040. Africa's population is young, urbanizing, and growing in consumer purchasing power. The combination of growing population, urbanization, and per capita income growth makes Africa's long-term economic trajectory unlike any other region on Earth. The headlines missed this story for 2 decades. Today we're going to look at the countries driving it. Here's the league table, and it might surprise you. Niger at the top? Yes. Niger had nominal GDP growth above 10% in 2022-23, driven by oil production coming online. But Niger is also the country that experienced a military coup in 2023, and its growth is narrow, mineral-dependent, and fragile. I'll flag those distinctions as we go. Senegal at number 2, a fascinating story. This has been one of Africa's most consistent democracies. Growth driven by services, remittances from the diaspora, and now offshore oil production. Senegal's trajectory is one of the most compelling in West Africa. Ethiopia at number 1 in sustained growth, with 8.5% average over a decade. 130 million people. The second most populous country in Africa. This is not a small country growing fast. This is a massive country growing fast, which has very different development implications. Rwanda, tiny country, extraordinary governance story. 7.2% average growth. We'll spend a full slide on this. Côte d'Ivoire, the renaissance of West Africa's most dynamic economy after years of civil war. Tanzania, Mozambique, Ghana, all growing consistently. Let's go deep on each. Ethiopia is the most important growth story in Africa, and the most complicated. Let's start with the scale. 130 million people. Africa's second most populous country after Nigeria. When an economy of 130 million people grows at 8.5% per year for a decade, you are witnessing the creation of the largest middle class in East African history. That is macroeconomically significant in a way that, say, Rwanda at 7% is not, because Rwanda has 14 million people. Ethiopia's growth model in the 2010s was deliberate, state-directed, and explicitly modeled on the Asian tigers. The government-built industrial parks. The flagship, Hawassa Industrial Park, a purpose-built textile and garment manufacturing zone. H&M, Nike, Calvin Klein. Some of the world's biggest fashion brands set up in Ethiopia, attracted by its young, cheap, and growing labor force. Ethiopia was executing a strategy that South Korea, Taiwan, and China had used before it. Build export-oriented manufacturing. Integrate into global supply chains. Use the export revenues to develop the broader economy. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is Africa's most audacious infrastructure project. Sitting on the Blue Nile, which provides 85% of Egypt's water, it will generate 5,150 megawatts of electricity when fully operational, transforming Ethiopia from a power-scarce to a power-surplus country. able to export electricity to Sudan, Djibouti, and beyond. And then, the Tigray Civil War, 2020 to 2022. Conservative estimates, 500,000 deaths. More by some counts. One of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century. The industrial parks were damaged. The international investment community paused. The country's reputation took a devastating hit. Ethiopia's growth story is real. It is also cautionary. Without political stability and inclusive governance, growth alone is insufficient. Rwanda is possibly the most remarkable development story in 21st century Africa. And it requires confronting an uncomfortable beginning. In April 1994, genocide began in Rwanda. In 100 days, approximately 800,000 people were killed, at a rate faster than any systematic killing in recorded history. The country was physically and psychologically destroyed. 30 years later, Rwanda has the strongest institutions in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the lowest corruption levels on the continent, an internationally recognized financial center, a world-class conference tourism industry, a digital government infrastructure that many European countries envy. This transformation was driven by Paul Kagame, a man who is simultaneously a developmental visionary and an authoritarian leader who has jailed journalists and opposition politicians, and who is credibly accused of political killings. Rwanda's success cannot be separated from Kagame, and Kagame cannot be uncritically celebrated. But the development record is real. The Ease of Doing Business score, which measures how straightforward it is to start and run a business, had Rwanda ranked 38th in the world in 2020. That is higher than France, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. A country that was in ruins 30 years ago is more business-friendly than most of Europe. The Singapore of Africa comparison, which Kagame himself has used, is apt in one dimension. Singapore was also built by an authoritarian leader, Lee Kuan Yew, with a tight grip on political opposition, who delivered exceptional governance and economic transformation. The comparison holds in its celebration of institutional quality. It holds equally in its limitation. Neither Singapore nor Rwanda has yet proved that the growth model survives the founder. Senegal is the story that doesn't fit the dominant African narrative, because the dominant narrative says you have to choose between democracy and economic growth in Africa. Either you have an authoritarian developmental state like Rwanda, or you have democratic chaos like Nigeria. Senegal says, false choice. Senegal has been a multi-party democracy since independence in 1960. 3 peaceful presidential transitions. Opposition parties that win. Courts that occasionally rule against the government. Free press. Imperfect, but real. And consistent economic growth averaging over 6% per year for a decade, with peaks above 10%. The Sangomar offshore oil field came online in 2024. This is the test. Senegal is a democracy. Its institutions, the courts, the parliament, the press, will scrutinize how oil revenues are managed in ways that institutions in Angola or Equatorial Guinea cannot. The Senegalese Sovereign Wealth Fund will face real accountability pressure. The diaspora economy is often overlooked in economic analyses. Senegalese abroad, in France, Italy, Spain, the United States, send home $2.50 to $3 billion per year. That is more than foreign direct investment in many years. And diaspora remittances come without conditionality, without interest payments, and without debt obligations. They go directly into household investment, children's education, family housing, small business capital. Senegal's model, democratic, diversified, managed resource development, may be the template that West Africa needs. Côte d'Ivoire is Africa's economic phoenix story. In the 1970s and 80s, Côte d'Ivoire was called the Ivorian Miracle, one of the most dynamic economies in Africa, driven by cocoa and coffee wealth, French investment, and the cosmopolitan leadership of President Félix Houphouët-Boigny. Then the cocoa price crashed in the late 1980s. The economy contracted. Houphouët-Boigny died in 1993. A period of political instability followed that culminated in 2 civil wars, a north-south split that tore the country apart from 2002 to 2011. In 2011, Alassane Ouattara, a technocrat who had been IMF deputy director, took power after a brutal post-election crisis. And he rebuilt, systematically. Ouattara prioritized 3 things: infrastructure, build the roads, ports, power plants and bridges that had been neglected or destroyed; institutions, reform the cocoa board, clean up the port, reduce corruption in customs; and macroeconomic stability, maintain the CFA franc peg, manage debt carefully. The result: 7.8% average annual growth for over a decade. Abidjan today is unrecognizable compared to 2011. New bridges, new highways, renovated port, a skyline of towers. The Plateau District, Abidjan's financial center, has become West Africa's most dynamic business hub. But the political foundations remain shaky. Ouattara broke his own constitution to run for a 3rd term. The opposition boycotted. The ethnic and regional divisions that fueled the civil wars have not been resolved. They have been managed. That is different. Tanzania is Africa's steady performer. Not the most dramatic growth story, but one of the most consistent and arguably the most sustainable. At 6.5% average annual growth with 65 million people, Tanzania represents a genuine structural transformation. Not a commodity boom, not a single sector story, but broad-based growth across agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, and increasingly services. Tanzania's tourism is genuinely world-class. The Serengeti, Ngorongoro, Kilimanjaro, the highest freestanding mountain on Earth, Zanzibar, an Indian Ocean island that is itself experiencing extraordinary growth in luxury tourism. Tanzania's wildlife product is better than Kenya's in some respects, and without Kenya's security reputation issues from certain periods. But the most important Tanzania story for the long term may be gas. The offshore gas discoveries, over 30 trillion cubic feet, represent a potential economic transformation comparable to Mozambique's. The Tanzania LNG project has been in negotiation since 2012. The complexity of a $30 billion infrastructure investment means it moves slowly. But when it happens, Tanzania will have a source of fiscal revenue that could fund the infrastructure leap the rest of the economy needs. President Samia Suluhu Hassan deserves recognition. When she took office in 2021 after the death of the eccentric and increasingly autocratic Magufuli, who had denied COVID, expelled NGOs, and alienated international partners, she immediately reversed course. She vaccinated Tanzania, repaired relationships with Western donors, and opened political space. That kind of institutional resilience, where institutions function even across leadership changes, is exactly what is needed. M-Pesa, two words that changed mobile finance globally. In 2007, Safaricom, Kenya's dominant mobile operator, launched M-Pesa. The concept: allow people to send money to each other using their mobile phone's SIM card as a digital wallet. No bank account required. No formal ID required in early versions. Just a phone. Kenyans, millions of whom were unbanked, immediately adopted it. By 2012, M-Pesa had more users than Kenya's entire formal banking system. By 2023, it was processing over $300 billion in annual transactions. It has been extended to Tanzania, Mozambique, Ghana, Egypt, and internationally. Western Union, PayPal, and Visa have all integrated with it. M-Pesa was invented in Kenya by Kenyans. The concept was developed by Kenyan researchers and Safaricom staff, without Silicon Valley, without European technology transfer. It is Africa's greatest fintech innovation story. Nairobi's Silicon Savannah is real. It is not just marketing. The concentration of funded African tech startups in Nairobi rivals Lagos, and both dwarf any other African city. International venture capital, Y Combinator, Sequoia, Partech, Novastar, has invested hundreds of millions in Kenyan startups. But Kenya's debt situation is genuinely concerning. Debt service, interest and principal repayments, now consumes over 50 cents of every dollar of government revenue. Infrastructure bonds issued under Uhuru Kenyatta's administration to fund the standard gauge railway and other projects have created a fiscal constraint that limits public investment. Kenya needs a debt restructuring conversation. Ghana is Africa's democratic success story and its most sobering recent economic cautionary tale. The democratic record is extraordinary. Since the 1992 Constitution, Ghana has held 8 successive elections. The 2000 election, where Jerry Rawlings's NDC lost to John Kufuor's NPP, was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposition parties in West Africa. The 2008 election, decided by 40,000 votes in a country of 30 million, was accepted by the loser. These are not small achievements. The oil discovery at Jubilee Field in 2007 was supposed to be the catalyst for Ghana's next development phase, and it provided revenue. But it also provided temptation. Successive NPP and NDC governments borrowed on the expectation of sustained oil revenue. They borrowed for infrastructure, for wages, for subsidies. When oil prices fell and COVID hit, the fiscal position was catastrophic. In 2022, Ghana defaulted on its external debt. The cedi, the Ghanaian currency, lost 60% of its value against the dollar in a single year. Inflation hit 54%. Grocery prices doubled. Petrol became unaffordable. Ghana went to the IMF. This is not Ghana specific. This is a pattern that follows many African countries that discover oil or minerals. The discovery creates fiscal optimism. The optimism creates borrowing, and when commodity prices correct, the debt remains. The lesson is that resource revenues should be saved, not borrowed against. Ghana is recovering. The 2024 elections, which produced another peaceful transfer of power, NDC defeating NPP, demonstrated that democratic institutions survive economic crisis. That is itself a form of resilience, worth recognizing. Mozambique contains within its borders one of the most dramatic convergences in African development, the world's third-largest natural gas discovery of the 21st century, and one of the continent's most severe and destabilizing security crises in the same province. The Rovuma Basin discovery changes Mozambique's fundamental economic trajectory. Before gas, Mozambique was a post-Civil War reconstruction story, growing from a devastatingly low base, with significant donor aid dependence. After gas, Mozambique has the potential to become a major LNG exporter, with sovereign wealth, infrastructure financing, and fiscal independence from donors. The Coral South FLNG, floating liquefied natural gas facility, the first offshore floating LNG platform in Africa, shipped its first cargo in 2022. This is a $4.7 billion project. When Total Energy's Area 1 project becomes fully operational, the scale of export revenues will be transformative. But Cabo Delgado, the insurgency that erupted in 2017, which has been claimed by groups linked to Al-Shabaab and ISIS, is rooted in precisely the dynamics we discussed when talking about the resource curse. A remote, marginalized, predominantly Muslim province, discovering it sits on enormous gas wealth while remaining extremely poor, and external jihadist recruiters exploiting that grievance. The government's response was initially dismal. Mozambican forces couldn't contain the insurgency. Rwanda's intervention in 2021, deploying elite troops, made the decisive difference and stabilized the gas-producing area. This created an interesting precedent. A smaller African nation, Rwanda, providing the security infrastructure for another African nation's resource development. Nigeria is Africa's most important economy and its most frustrating growth story. $500 billion GDP, 220 million people, the continent's largest population, and its largest economic output. Nigeria has more potential than almost any country on Earth, and it has been squandering that potential for 50 years. The oil trap is real. Nigeria discovered oil in commercial quantities in 1956. Since 1970, Nigeria has earned over $600 billion in oil revenues. And per capita income today, in real terms, is lower than it was at independence in 1960. The money went somewhere. It went into the pockets of a political class whose corruption is not a bug in the system. It is the system. But here's what the oil story obscures. Nigeria's non-oil economy is large, dynamic, and genuinely growing. The Lagos commercial economy, trading, logistics, manufacturing, services, is one of Africa's most vibrant. The fintech sector, Flutterwave, OPay, Interswitch, unicorns worth $1 billion plus each. Nollywood produces 2,500 films per year. Afrobeats has globalized Nigerian culture in a way that 50 years of diplomacy couldn't. Tinubu's 2023 reforms were economically correct and politically painful. Removing the fuel subsidy, which was costing $10 billion per year, and primarily benefiting fuel importers who could manipulate the system, freed up fiscal resources. Unifying the exchange rate, which had created a black market and deterred legitimate investment, made Nigeria's price signals honest. The short-term pain was severe. The long-term logic is sound. Nigeria's trajectory depends on security. Without resolving the insecurity in the north, southeast, and delta, Nigeria cannot attract the manufacturing investment it needs. South Africa is not on the fastest-growing economies list. It has grown at 1 to 2% per year for the past decade, well below the African average, and far below its potential. And yet it is arguably Africa's most important economy, because of what it could unleash. South Africa has the most sophisticated financial sector in Africa. The JSE handles more daily transactions than most European stock exchanges. South Africa has 26 universities ranked among the world's top 1,000, more than any other African country. It has the continent's most advanced manufacturing sector, a world-class telecommunications infrastructure, and institutions, courts, Reserve Bank, Auditor General, that function with real independence. And yet, 33% unemployment, load shedding for 200+ days a year. A capital city whose water system is failing. A state railway, Transnet, that cannot reliably move goods. The contradiction between South Africa's institutional endowment and its governance outcomes is the most expensive puzzle in African economics. The Zuma-era answer is clear. When state institutions are captured by politically connected networks that divert resources for private benefit, public services collapse. Eskom, once one of the world's best-run power utilities, was systematically looted and mismanaged under Zuma-era appointments. The result, 200+ days of rolling blackouts, costing an estimated 5% of GDP. The 2024 Government of National Unity, bringing the ANC and DA into coalition, is the most significant political event in South Africa since 1994. Whether it produces genuine institutional reform or becomes another vehicle for managing factional competition is the question that will determine South Africa's economic future. Angola is the most dramatic reconstruction story in Africa and the clearest demonstration of oil's double-edged nature. After 27 years of civil war, a conflict that was partly a proxy Cold War between the US-backed UNITA and Soviet, Cuban-backed MPLA, but was also genuinely about the control of Angola's diamond and oil wealth, peace came in 2002. and oil revenues enabled reconstruction at remarkable speed. Luanda became, absurdly, the most expensive city in the world for expatriates in the mid-2010s. A bowl of pasta in a Luanda restaurant cost $55. A bottle of beer cost $12. Oil revenues created a bubble of extreme wealth in the capital, while most of Angola's population had no electricity, no piped water, and no health care. João Lourenço's anti-corruption campaign is real. The targeting of the Dos Santos family network was genuine. Isabel dos Santos, whose business empire was built through exclusive access to Angolan state contracts and resources granted by her father, had assets frozen internationally. The Luanda leaks, thousands of documents published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, documented the scale of the kleptocracy. But is Lourenço's anti-corruption drive systematic reform, or the replacement of one elite network with another? Angola doesn't yet have the institutional independence, independent courts, independent media, empowered civil society, to answer that question definitively. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the most important country in Africa that is not growing, and therefore the most important country to understand when thinking about African development. GDP per capita, approximately $600. Mineral wealth, estimated at $24 trillion by the Congolese government. The arithmetic is stark. If every Congolese citizen received an equal share of their country's mineral wealth, each person would be a millionaire. Instead, the average Congolese lives on $1.65 per day. This is not a geological mystery. It is a governance disaster, sustained over 60 years of post-colonial history. Mobutu Sese Seko, who renamed the country Zaire, and himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kukunbendu W. Zabanga, meaning the warrior who knows no defeat because of his endurance and inflexible will and is all-powerful, leaving fire in his wake as he goes from conquest to conquest, ran the country as his personal ATM for 32 years. When he was removed in 1997, the country he left was hollowed out. The Eastern Congo's perpetual conflict, which has cost more lives than almost any war since World War II, is fundamentally a conflict over minerals: cobalt, coltan, gold, cassiterite. International corporations buy these minerals. International consumers use the products. International governments do nothing meaningful. The Inga Dam site on the lower Congo River is the world's largest untapped hydropower potential, 40,000 megawatts of generatable electricity, enough to power all of sub-Saharan Africa. It has been studied, proposed, and planned for 60 years. It has never been built. Before we continue, if you are a builders, creators, entrepreneurs, purpose-driven individuals, the GriotWave Inner Circle is now open. Pause the video right now and scan the QR code to join the early interest list. What makes some African economies grow faster than others? After studying the evidence across the continent, 6 factors consistently appear. First and most important, governance. The single clearest predictor of sustained growth in Africa is the quality of public institutions, not ideology. Rwanda is state capitalist. Botswana is social democratic. Mauritius is liberal market. What they share is that public institutions work. Contracts are enforceable. Regulatory processes are transparent. Corruption is limited. Without this, everything else is harder. Second, infrastructure. The African Development Bank estimates Africa's infrastructure gap at $108 billion per year. Manufacturers cannot compete if power cuts 10 hours a day. Agricultural products rot if roads are impassable. Services cannot scale without broadband. Infrastructure is not glamorous, but it is the foundation. Third, urbanization. This is the most powerful structural economic force operating in Africa right now. As people move from subsistence farming to urban economic participation, productivity surges. The challenge: African cities need to absorb this growth into decent housing, sanitation, and employment, or urbanization becomes a slum creation process rather than a development one. Fourth, the youth bulge. By 2030, Africa will have 600 million people aged 15 to 24. That is the world's largest young workforce. The demographic dividend or demographic disaster question depends entirely on whether there are productive jobs for them. Fifth, technology leapfrog. This is Africa's most exciting economic story. Direct from subsistence agriculture to mobile money. From no electricity to rooftop solar. From no banking to fintech unicorns. Sixth, commodity cycles. They matter, but they are not destiny. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area may be the most consequential African policy decision of the 21st century. And most of the world isn't paying attention. The premise is simple. African countries trade barely 16% of their total trade with each other, compared to 68% in Europe. That means African manufacturers and farmers cannot access the continental market that should be their primary one. A Ghanaian processed food manufacturer faces high tariffs selling to Senegal, but a French processed food manufacturer faces lower barriers. This structure, inherited from colonial trade arrangements, keeps Africa in the position of raw material exporter to the world rather than manufacturer for itself. AfCFTA, if implemented, changes this logic. 1.4 billion consumers in a single market by 2035, 2 billion. For manufacturing, this changes the investment calculation. You can build a factory that serves the continent, not just one country. Ethiopian garment manufacturers, Kenyan pharmaceutical companies, Egyptian technology firms, South African automotive suppliers, all of them become more competitive when their potential market is 1.4 billion people. The IMF estimates that full AfCFTA implementation would add $450 billion to African GDP by 2035, a roughly 10% increase over the baseline projection. That is not a marginal gain. The challenges are real. Tariffs are just one barrier. Border procedures in many countries take days. Corruption at checkpoints adds cost. Transport infrastructure is missing in critical corridors. Standards and regulations differ between countries. Resolving these barriers requires sustained political commitment from African governments that have often preferred the revenue from tariffs to the efficiency gains from free trade. The Africa tech story is happening right now, and it is one of the most extraordinary economic innovation stories in the world. In 2021, the peak year for African startup funding, African tech companies raised $5 billion. This was a 5x increase from 2019. 4 African startups achieved unicorn status, $1 billion plus valuation, in that year alone. And the innovation is indigenous. M-Pesa was not imported from Silicon Valley. It was created by Safaricom's Kenyan engineers. GriotWave, the Nigerian payment infrastructure company now valued at $3 billion, was founded by Nigerians solving Nigerian problems. Wave, the Senegalese mobile money disruptor that offers transfers for free and makes money only on exchange rates, is a French-American co-founded company that understood the West African market better than the established telecoms operators. The agricultural technology sector is particularly important because 60% of Africans still work in agriculture. Twiga Foods, the Kenyan company that has digitized the fresh produce supply chain between Kenyan farmers and urban vendors, has both increased farmer revenues by cutting out exploitative middlemen and reduced the cost of vegetables in Nairobi. That is a technology achieving development outcomes. Zipline's drone delivery system in Rwanda and Ghana, delivering blood, vaccines, and medicines to remote health facilities, has extended healthcare access to populations that road-based logistics couldn't reach cost-effectively. It is now operating in Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire. Africa's tech sector is not a Silicon Valley replica. It is solving African problems with African knowledge, using digital tools that are now globally competitive. The most consequential economic question about Africa over the next 30 years is not, how fast is it growing now? It is, what happens when 600 million young Africans enter the labor market? 600 million people aged 15 to 24 in Africa by 2030. That is more young people than exist in Europe and the United States combined. They are coming. The question is what they find when they arrive. The demographic dividend is real and historically documented. East Asia's economic miracle in the 1960s through 90s was partly powered by exactly this dynamic. A large young working-age population, falling birth rates, and rising female labor participation created a productivity surge. Africa is at the beginning of this transition. Birth rates are falling, female education is rising, urbanization is increasing. But the dividend requires conditions: educated workers, jobs to absorb them, physical infrastructure, electricity, transport, that enables the economy to expand, and institutions that allow businesses to form, hire, invest, and grow without being crushed by corruption, arbitrary regulation, or violence. The risk: youth unemployment. In economies that don't create sufficient formal employment, which is most of Africa today, the young population creates pressure, not productivity. Young, unemployed, educated men and women are the primary demographic of political instability, migration pressure, and recruitment targets for extremist groups. The choice being made right now, in education investments, in infrastructure build, in manufacturing policy, will determine whether Africa's demographic future is a dividend or a disaster. To understand Africa's growth story honestly, we need to be equally honest about what's holding it back. 6 structural barriers. Debt. The post-COVID interest rate spike was catastrophic for African borrowers. Countries that had borrowed in dollars or euros at floating rates suddenly found their debt service costs had tripled. Ghana defaulted in 2022. Zambia in 2020. Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia are all under significant debt stress. The G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring has been agonizingly slow. African countries are paying debt service while cutting health and education spending. Energy. 600 million people with no electricity. This is not a development challenge. It is a fundamental barrier to any economic modernity. Manufacturing cannot operate without power. Cold chains cannot maintain food safety. Digital economy cannot function. The energy gap is the single most tractable infrastructure barrier. Solar costs have fallen 90% in a decade, but it requires financing. Conflict. The Sahel has experienced 10 military coups since 2020. Eastern DRC is a perpetual war zone. Sudan is in civil war. These are not peripheral events. They consume development resources, destroy human capital, and create humanitarian crises that reverse years of progress. Climate. Africa's farmers, 600+ million of them, are experiencing more variable rainfall, more extreme heat, and more frequent droughts. This is not a future risk. It is a present reality. Agricultural productivity in the Sahel has declined measurably over 20 years. Brain drain. The ethical crisis nobody discusses. Nigeria trains doctors. The UK NHS recruits them. Africa pays for the medical education. Wealthy countries benefit from the skilled graduate. The geopolitics of African investment has become one of the most competitive arenas in global politics. And this competition, for the right terms, is actually beneficial to Africa if managed intelligently. China's infrastructure model is the most consistent. Roads, railways, ports, dams, and telecommunications, built by Chinese firms, often with Chinese workers, financed by Chinese loans. The standard gauge railway in Kenya, the Ethiopian Addis-Djibouti Railway, the Nairobi Expressway, all Chinese. The infrastructure is real. The financing terms have sometimes been opaque. The local employment content has been lower than advertised, but the infrastructure exists. The EU's Global Gateway is an explicit competitor, €150 billion pledged for African infrastructure over 2021 to 2030, focused specifically on green energy infrastructure and digital connectivity. The design reflects European priorities, climate-compatible infrastructure, but the disbursement mechanisms have been slower than China's. And the EU's reputation for conditionality, attaching governance and procurement standards to loans, is both a feature, accountability, and a bug, bureaucratic delay. The U.S. Lobedo Corridor is the most geopolitically interesting recent development. The Biden administration committed to a railway connecting the Democratic Republic of Congo's copper-cobalt mining belt through Zambia to Angola's Lobedo port, and U.S. infrastructure investment in the world's most strategically important mineral region. The subtext. The U.S. wants DRC's critical minerals for American EV supply chains, and investing in logistics infrastructure is the entry price. Africa's leaders understand the competitive dynamics. The leverage is real. The question is whether to exploit it wisely. Before we go to the takeaways, we need to acknowledge the countries that have been doing this right for decades, but rarely get the attention they deserve. Mauritius, a small island nation of 1.3 million people, 2,000 kilometers off the East African coast, with no oil, no minerals, and once entirely dependent on sugar. Today, GDP per capita of $10,800, Africa's second highest after the Seychelles. Africa's top-ranked country on the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index for 10 consecutive years. A financial services hub that manages significant global investment flows. A tourism sector renowned globally for quality. Mauritius achieved this through 50 years of consistent progressive policy, diversifying from sugar to textile manufacturing to financial services to technology, without dramatic reversals. Botswana, I've already mentioned, the diamond management story. But it's worth reinforcing. Starting from being one of the world's 3 poorest countries at independence in 1966, Botswana transformed into an upper-middle income country with consistent democracy, manageable debt, and strong institutions. This took political will, intelligence, and the absence of the ideological experiments that plagued other post-colonial African governments. Cape Verde, no natural resources. No oil, no minerals, tiny country. Yet consistently, Africa's most democratically stable country, with GDP per capita of $4,500, powered by tourism, services, and diaspora remittances. The lesson: you don't need oil to develop. You need governance. These countries are not anomalies. They are proof that the development model works when institutions function. In the middle of Africa's growth story, we must be honest about the Sahel, because if you only look at Rwanda and Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, you are looking at half the picture. Since 2020, the Sahel and its immediate neighbors have experienced approximately 10 successful military coups. Mali twice, Burkina Faso twice, Guinea, Niger, Sudan, Chad, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau attempted. This is extraordinary, a wave of authoritarian reversion without precedent in modern African history. The coups did not come from nowhere. They came from places where civilian governments had demonstrably failed to protect citizens from jihadist violence, provide basic services, or create economic opportunity for rapidly growing young populations. The militaries that took power were welcomed in some cases by populations who had lost faith in elected governments. Because those elected governments had lost faith in their populations, governing primarily for elite enrichment. Climate change is an accelerant. The Sahel is one of the world's fastest warming regions. Agricultural failure drives conflict between farmers and nomadic pastoralists. Drought drives migration. Food insecurity creates vulnerability to extremist recruitment. The Sahel's security crisis and its climate crisis are the same crisis. The regional response has been inadequate. ECOWAS imposed sanctions on coup governments, which hurt ordinary people without deterring military rulers. France's withdrawal, forced by coup governments that had turned anti-French sentiment into a political tool, created a security vacuum. Russia's Wagner Group and its successor Africa Corps filled part of that vacuum. None of these actors are invested in the long-term development of the Sahel. The Sahel is Africa's most urgent governance crisis. Ignoring it while celebrating growth elsewhere is dishonest. Climate change is not a future threat to African economic growth. It is a present one. The African Development Bank estimates that climate change is costing Africa between 5 and 15% of GDP per year, depending on the country and the methodology. This is an enormous figure. Kenya, which grows at 5.4% per year, may be losing 2 to 3% of GDP annually to climate impacts. The net growth rate is therefore significantly lower than headline GDP figures suggest. Agriculture employs 60% of Africans and accounts for 15 to 25% of GDP in most African economies. African agriculture is 80% rain-fed. When rainfall becomes less predictable, which climate change is making it, 60% of the population is directly exposed to economic loss. The 2022 Horn of Africa drought was the worst in 40 years. 22 million people faced acute food insecurity in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia simultaneously. The injustice is mathematical and undeniable. Africa has emitted approximately 4% of all greenhouse gases since industrialization began. The United States has emitted over 25%. Europe over 22%. Africa is bearing consequences it did not create, at a scale proportionally greater than any other region. The climate finance architecture, loss and damage funds, Green Climate Fund, bilateral green development finance, is slowly beginning to recognize this. The 2022 COP agreement to establish a loss and damage fund was a meaningful step, but the amounts committed remain far below what the economic impact requires. Africa's negotiating position in climate talks is actually quite strong. It has enormous sequestration capacity, solar and wind potential, and the moral authority of the victim. Using that position to extract meaningful climate finance commitments is the task of African climate diplomacy. Here is the full picture. Africa's 10 largest economies by total GDP with their growth rates. Nigeria at number 1, $506 billion. Africa's largest economy by a significant margin, but growing at only 3.2%, below the African average. And given Nigeria's 220 million population, barely keeping up with population growth. Egypt at number 2, $395 billion. Growing at 4.2%. Egypt's growth has been driven by infrastructure investment, the Suez Canal expansion, and a massive IMF-supported reform program. The political context, Sisi's authoritarian government, is complex. South Africa at number 3, $374 billion, growing at 1.2%. Africa's most sophisticated economy growing the slowest, for reasons we discussed. And here is the most important column. The growth rates. Ethiopia at 8.5% on a $160 billion base. Côte d'Ivoire at 7.8% on a $78 billion base. Kenya at 5.4%. Ghana at 5.9%. The pattern is clear. Africa's largest economies, Nigeria, South Africa, are underperforming. Africa's medium-sized, better-governed economies, Ethiopia, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Rwanda, are performing strongly. The lesson: size and growth are inversely correlated in Africa right now, because the obstacles to growth, governance, institutions, conflict, are harder to overcome at scale. This is not necessarily permanent, but it explains why Africa's growth story is not yet one single narrative. It is 55 different stories, at very different stages. After going through country after country in this video, one variable is more consistently predictive of economic growth than any other: governance quality. Botswana and the DRC both have enormous mineral wealth. Botswana manages its diamonds through the Debswana model and a sovereign wealth fund, and has GDP per capita of $8,000. The DRC has $24 trillion in estimated mineral wealth and GDP per capita of $600. The difference is not the minerals. It is who controls them and how. The Mo Ibrahim African Governance Index, the most rigorous annual assessment of African governance, consistently shows the same pattern. Countries that rank highly on safety, rule of law, economic management, and human development are the countries growing fastest and most sustainably. The democracy versus authoritarianism debate is a false one in African economic development. The data does not support the idea that authoritarian regimes grow faster in Africa. Botswana, Mauritius, Senegal, and Cape Verde, all genuine democracies, have consistently outperformed most authoritarian states over 30-year timeframes. Rwanda is the exception, and Rwanda's success is about institutional quality, transparent, efficient, low-corruption institutions, not just the absence of democratic accountability. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation has given its prize for excellent governance only 6 times in 17 years. This is the prize that awards $5 million, the world's largest individual award, to African presidents who governed well and left office constitutionally. Only 6 leaders in 17 years have qualified. That scarcity tells you everything about the governance challenge. But those 6 exist. The prize has been won. Governance excellence is possible. 5 myths, 5 truths. Let me be fast and precise. Myth 1. Africa is not growing. This is simply false. Multiple African economies have outgrown China and India in recent years. The data has been clear for 2 decades. The perception hasn't caught up. Myth 2. African growth is just resource extraction. Kenya grows on fintech and tourism, not oil. Rwanda grows on governance and services, not minerals. Ethiopia grew on manufacturing and infrastructure. The diversification story is real. Myth 3. You need aid to develop in Africa. Mauritius received aid and deliberately reduced its aid dependency as it developed. Botswana used diamond revenues, not aid, to build its welfare state. The most sustainable African development has been self-financed through resource management and investment attraction. Myth 4. Democracy holds back African growth. This is the argument authoritarian governments make to justify staying in power. The evidence doesn't support it. Botswana, Mauritius, Cape Verde, Senegal all demonstrate that democratic governance and development are compatible and mutually reinforcing. Myth 5. African growth doesn't reach ordinary people. Rwanda's poverty reduction is one of the fastest in development history. Ethiopia's urban poverty rate more than halved in a decade. The question is not whether growth helps ordinary people, it does, but whether it helps them at a sufficient rate to address the backlog of deprivation. The answer, not fast enough, but real progress is happening. Your quick reference. A few highlights. Senegal at 8.8%, the fastest growing democracy in Africa, and arguably the most instructive model for West Africa. Democratic plus growing. That combination should be celebrated and studied. Ethiopia at 8.5%, the most important growth story in Africa by scale, with the most complex shadows, Tigray War. Watch whether Abiy Ahmed rebuilds national cohesion. Nigeria at 3.2%, and South Africa at 1.2%. These are the economies that should dominate Africa's growth story. They have the populations, the resources, the institutional bases. Both are significantly underperforming. Nigeria's Tinubu reforms and South Africa's GNU are the tests. Mauritius and Botswana at the bottom of this list are the best development stories on the continent. Consistent, diversified, democratic, well-governed. They are not fast growers, because they have already grown. Their base is higher. The pattern I want you to remember: growth rate and base GDP are inversely correlated in Africa right now. Countries growing fastest are growing from a low base. The developmental challenge is sustaining that growth long enough to build a diversified, resilient economy, like Mauritius has done. 8 things you now know about Africa's fastest-growing economies. 1. The growth is real. Multiple African economies have grown faster than China. The narrative that Africa doesn't grow is wrong. 2. The leaders: Senegal, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania. Each with a distinct model, each with its shadows. 3. Rwanda's transformation, the most important governance story in the world. From the worst starting point imaginable to Africa's best institutions in 30 years. 4. Africa's fintech leadership. M-Pesa invented something. GriotWave built something. These are not adaptations of Western models. They are original African solutions to African problems. 5. AfCFTA. The Continental Free Trade Area could be as important to African economic integration as the EU's single market was to European growth. The difference: Africa has to build the logistics infrastructure simultaneously. 6. Governance is everything. Not oil, not geography, institutions. 7. Climate is costing real growth points. Every percentage point of climate damage that could have been development gain is a moral and economic injustice. 8. The Sahel is the warning. Growth without inclusion, security, and democratic legitimacy doesn't last. The coup wave is what happens when development reaches Abidjan, but not Ouagadougou. Deliver slowly, with genuine emotion. Script: Africa's rise is not a headline. It is not a trend. It is not a forecast. It is a generation of choices, being made right now by 1.4 billion people, one decision at a time. A Rwandan student choosing to stay in Kigali and build a company instead of emigrating. An Ethiopian factory worker earning her first formal wage and sending her daughter to school. A Senegalese entrepreneur who launched a fintech startup because she knew the problem her community faced and knew she could solve it. A Nairobi software engineer writing code that will be used by people who have never heard of Kenya. A Mauritian judge ruling against a politician because the law says so. These are the foundations of the growth story we have told today. Not just GDP statistics. Not just IMF projections. These are human choices, made in the face of climate crisis, debt pressure, governance failure, and conflict, to build something better. Africa's growth is real. Its challenges are real. Its potential is extraordinary. And its story is being written right now, by Africans, in ways that the world has rarely paid sufficient attention to. Subscribe to GriotWave Academy. Share this video. Tag someone who still thinks of Africa as a charity case, and show them what a continent of 1.4 billion people building its own future actually looks like. We'll see you next time. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.